We are going to be in Psalm 37, verses 1 through 13 and 23 through 39. Do not be agitated by evildoers. Do not envy those who do wrong, for they wither quickly like grass and wilt tender green plants. Trust in the Lord and do what is good. Dwell in the land and live securely. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desire. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act, making your righteousness shine like the dawn and your justice like the noonday. Be silent before the Lord and wait expectantly for him. Do not be agitated by one who prospers in his way, by the person who carries out evil plans. Refrain from anger and give up your rage. Do not be agitated, it can only bring harm. For evildoers will be destroyed, but those who put their hope in the Lord will inherit the land. A little while, and the wicked person will be no more. Though you look for him, he will not be there. By the humble he will inherit the land and will enjoy abundant prosperity. The wicked person schemes against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. The Lord laughs at him because he sees that his day is coming. And verse 23. A person's steps are established by the Lord, and he takes pleasure in his way. Though he falls, he will not be overwhelmed, because the Lord supports him with his hand. I have been young, and now I am old, yet I have not seen the righteous abandoned, or his children begging for bread. He is always generous, always lending, and his children are a blessing. Turn away from evil, do what is good, and settle permanently. For the Lord loves justice and will not abandon his faithful ones. They are kept safe forever, but the children of the wicked will be destroyed, and the righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it permanently.
Well, we are Psalm 37 today. Last week we looked at Psalm 5. We're in this Advent series where we're taking a look at a few of the Psalms to help us understand just what it means to step into the shoes of Old Testament Israel and long for the coming of the Messiah. But not just to step into their shoes, but also to just be aware of what it means to be human and to feel the range of human emotion as we see different things on the news, we watch things, we read about things, and are trying to understand how do we process all of this that's happening, knowing that there is a second advent of Jesus that is coming. That one day Jesus will return, and we long for that day because we see that there's still evil in the world, and things still aren't as we would like them to be. They're still not as they were in the Garden of Eden, but we're promised that that day is coming, and so we look forward to it with longing and expectancy. And so today we're jumping into Psalm 37, which, as you can see from the title, is another Psalm of David. And if last week was a blueprint of like what to do in a crisis, right? You read the headlines and your heart sinks and, oh man, here we go again. Or you get the phone call and, oh man, if Psalm 5 is crisis counseling, Psalm 37 is more process counseling. It's a long-term thing. These are truths that David wants us to keep rehearsing over and over as we go on throughout our life. I don't know if you've ever sat down with someone and asked them for advice, or maybe it was a counselor. And sometimes as you're talking to someone and you know, you say what's going on in your life and they start to offer advice back to you, right away you can tell they know exactly what I'm talking about. Right? There's some people you can just tell they've been in my shoes. They relate to this. They've been there, done that. Just by their voice inflection, their body language, whatever it is, you know they know exactly what I'm talking about. They speak from experience. And then there's others that you can tell that they're trying to imagine themselves in your shoes. They're trying to empathize with you and imagine what it would be like to be in your shoes. Doesn't mean that their advice is bad. Doesn't mean it's ungodly or it's not helpful. You can just tell they just haven't been through the same thing that I have. They don't know the situation. That's not David. David is the first one. David is near the end of his life now in Psalm 30, as he's writing Psalm 37, and he's wise. He's seen some things. He's been around and been through some really hard things. But what's beautiful here about Psalm 37 is that David comes at this gently. Meaning, I imagine sitting down over coffee with David. That's what Psalm 37 is to me. You're sitting down with King David over coffee, and his eyes are happy. He's got a half smile on, like he's not standing over you, angrily teaching you, hey, don't fret about evil. He's sitting down with you and just with kind eyes and experience in his voice, giving us wisdom. And so I encourage you this morning, just to however you have to imagine that in your head, this is a conversation with King David, which is pretty cool, that God has allowed us to have this experience here in Scripture. And so listen to the wisdom of David in verse 1. Do not be agitated by evildoers. Do not envy those who do wrong. That word agitated refers to fretting. It's a worry, it's an anxiousness. And maybe as you read that, you're like, don't be agitated, don't fret over evildoers. Okay, that makes sense. But the next line, do not envy those who do wrong. You're like, well, not a problem. What do you mean envy people that do wrong? Who envies people that do wrong? Well, that word envy, or maybe it's jealousy in your translation, doesn't necessarily mean I really want what they have. I want to be like them. It might mean a little closer to being a jealous husband or something, which is an obsessive worry or anxiousness. And so it seems like what David is talking about here is these moments when we see evil, when it appears that evil is going unchecked in the world. We see something, it doesn't feel right, doesn't sit right, it seems like it's oppressive, there's the strong are overpowering the weak, and it seems like they get away with it. It seems like the powerful just take advantage of the weak, and sometimes when we see that enough times, again and again, we start to think, we start to get agitated with God. Like, what are you doing here? We get agitated with God as if he were unkind to the world and unkind to his church even, in allowing these sort of things to happen, in allowing this kind of wickedness to go on. These men and women to live and prosper and just get away with whatever they want to do. And that's where that jealousy and envy can kind of start to creep in, where we sort of start to think, if I didn't have a conscience, if I wasn't really trying to honor and please the Lord here, I could actually return the favor sometimes. I could actually maybe get away with some things. They seem pretty happy in their twisted little world. I wouldn't mind having some of that joy myself. And one of the ways that played out for Jody and I recently was we had been looking for an old truck for a while, and so we finally made a purchase, got an old pickup truck, and we bought it privately. And so as the seller was writing up this bill of sale for us, he wrote his name on the paper, he wrote our names on the paper, and the date and everything, and we all signed the paper. And then he drew a line and put a $sign on it, and he said, I'll just leave that blank. And then when you get home, you can write whatever you want in there. Because, you pay tax on whatever the price of the vehicle was. So write whatever you want in the line. And the thought kind of starts to cross your mind. The government takes stuff from us all the time. They pick our pockets all the time. And finally, the little guy has some power. Finally, the little guy is in a position where I can actually pick theirs. And it feels pretty good. It's not that much compared to what they do to me anyway, right? We can talk ourselves into all kinds of things. But that's what David is kind of warning us about here. Don't play that game. Don't envy those who do wrong. And then he tells you why. And it's because evil has a shelf life. Look at verse 2. For, this is why. Because they, the evildoers, wither quickly like grass, and they wilt like tender green plants. I'm sure everyone in this room has picked up some food, a container of food, a box of cereal, gallon of milk, whatever. You've looked in your fridge, you've picked something off the shelf, and you've looked at the expiration date. Right? We've all done it. We all pick it up and go, oh, July 22. That's not too bad. Live on the edge a little bit. And David is reminding us that evil has an expiration date too. When we pick something out of our fridge, there is a day coming when that milk should be dumped out. when it stops looking like milk, a little more like cottage cheese, it is time for that to be removed and thrown aside. And David says, yeah, it's the same with evil. There is an expiration date on every world system, every structure, every power who persists in evil. In fact, there's an expiration date on evil in general. There's a day coming when evil and the people who persist in it will be removed and thrown aside. And so don't be jealous of them now. Because if you envy the wicked, you are envying grass that grows its green for a few months and then it turns brown and it's gone. So don't envy the gallon of milk that is already turning and will one day be tossed out. Instead, verse 3, trust in the Lord and do what is good. Dwell in the land and live securely. Or some other translations say, dwell in the land and feed on faithfulness. I love that. Feed on faithfulness. This thing of dwelling in the land, it's the language of covenant in the Old Testament. And so in other words, what David is saying is trust in the Lord, do what is good, and feed on the covenant promises of God. Trust that he knows what's happening, he sees what's happening, and he will expose the darkness for what it is. Trust him that he will take care of it. You can also trust that he will take care of you and your needs. That's verse 4. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desires. Now, I know what we want to read into that is that God is a cosmic vending machine that will fulfill every appetite and preference and impulse that we have, and that's not what it means. I think it means that desire and delight go hand in hand. Desire and delight go hand in hand. So David's advice is to delight in the Lord, to enjoy his presence, to want to be near him, to want to be close to him, to celebrate his love and his grace and his blessing, to find our satisfaction in him more than we find it in anything else in this life. Find our satisfaction in him. And when you do, we find that he meets you there. And he gives you the very thing you are most delighted in, which is himself. And we delight ourselves in the Lord, and that's what brings us joy and happiness. Of course, we're going to want to desire more of that, and he meets us there. So when we take delight in the Lord, he fulfills those desires in giving us more of himself. Verse 5 then, commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. That's a promise. He will act, making your righteousness shine like the dawn, your justice like the noonday. That line, commit your ways to the Lord, literally means to roll your ways up onto him. It's the same idea as 1 Peter 5:7 that says, cast your cares on the Lord because he cares for you. It's this idea of spreading out your cares or just rolling them onto the Lord and leaving the outcome to him. That's the opposite of being agitated and anxious. It's the opposite of fretting and worrying. The promise here is that he will act. So even if somebody has thrown you under the bus or it feels like the world is against you, God will, in due time, clear up everything that is cloudy. And he will shine into everything that seems dark. God will make sure that his people are never, ever hung out to dry. And so we can, verse 7, be silent before the Lord and wait expectantly for him. Here it is again. Do not be agitated by one who prospers in his way, by that person who carries out the evil plans. Again, don't be agitated by them. That idea of waiting expectantly is the idea of giving birth. It's the idea of pregnancy. And so when we look at the world and we see this evil happening in it, we all kind of wonder, why, God, aren't you doing something about this? Why isn't God doing something here? And kind of in this language, at least this is where I went with it, that's like looking at an expectant mother and saying, why don't you have a baby yet? And she might say, I already do. I already do. but you're going to have to stop asking and wait patiently. We wait expectantly, knowing that that child that is already here developing will soon be here in fullness. And in the same way, we know God has promised, I'm going to rid the world of evil. We know he's already doing it on some level, but we wait expectantly for him to rid the world of evil in full, knowing that while that process has begun, it hasn't come in fullness yet, but it's coming. So wait expectantly, believing that God is going to do what he says. And while we wait, verse 8, refrain from anger and give up your rage. And a third time, do not be agitated, this time with a warning. It can only bring harm. It can only bring harm to be agitated. For, verse 9, evildoers will be destroyed. That's another promise. But those who put their hope in the Lord will inherit the land. Another promise. Again, that's covenant language. They'll receive covenant blessings. Verse 10, a little while yet. Again, that picture of a baby developing in her mother's womb. A little while, just a couple more months, she'll be born. So just a little while, and the wicked person will be no more. Even though you look for him, he will not be there. But again, promise, the humble will inherit the land and will enjoy abundant prosperity. I said last week when I was introducing this Psalms series that the Psalms give us permission to be anxious and fearful because God knows we're human. We can't see into the future like he can. And so we're going to have these natural tendencies to be a little bit afraid. I don't know what's going to happen. We're going to have this natural tendency to struggle with decisions that we make because we just don't know how things are going to work out like he does. And he understands that. And so the book of Psalms is kind of permission to be human, right? But while they give us permission to be human, they also encourage us to bring our anxiousness and our fearfulness to the Lord. While we may be given permission to feel those kind of things, we're not given permission to stay there forever. We're not to stay in fear and anxiety. It only brings harm, verse 8 says. There is nothing good that comes from living in constant anxiety and constant fear. But a lot of the times we have our minds set on the flesh. We have our minds set on only what we can see in the physical realm, right? That's usually where our minds are at. And so remember, we're studying the Psalms because they help us make sense of the bigger picture of what's going on in the world around us and the things that happen to us. And so verse 12 and 13 are going to say, listen, there's more to this than what you can see. Verse 12, the wicked person schemes against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. And here on earth, in the physical realm, what we can see, there are intentional plans by human power structures and systems and individuals to live independently of God. Right? We see it more and more all the time. We see it more and more all the time. We even recognize it in ourselves. But we see it in our country. We see it around the world. These power structures and systems that are targeting Christians or churches or pastors and accusing them of being what's wrong with the world instead of part of the solution. I remember being on a plane many years ago when I was a worship pastor and just watching this woman's face in the seat next to me when she said, "So what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a worship pastor." And like the conversation was over. That was it. She was not interested in talking. And I'm not saying everybody's like that, but I'm saying it's there and we see it more and more all the time. Anymore, it seems like if you stand for some truth from God's word, someone is actively working against it to make it hate speech or divisive or whatever label they want to put on it. And so as we see that happening, it's even the most sincere believer can allow fear to start to creep in. And we can start to get defensive and we can start to worry and be agitated and fret about these schemes that are coming against us. But here's what David wants us to know, that while people with evil intent are sitting at home drawing up plans for how to take down God's people, here's what's going on in God's realm where only he lives, verse 13, the Lord laughs at him because he sees his day is coming. I don't know how that lands with you, but the Lord laughs at them. It literally means he finds it amusing. It's entertaining. Oh, that's a cute plan you have drawn up there to take down my people. It's kind of amusing. Now, that doesn't mean that he is, it doesn't mean that he's flippant about it. It just means that God is in the opposite state of agitated. He is in the opposite place of anxious or fearful. He's the opposite of panic. That's why he tells us, don't be anxious. It's because he's not anxious. And he's with us. He invites us, just trust me. Trust me. Bring your cares to me and let me deal with them. Trust me. Don't let yourself be agitated by evil in the world. Just do what is good and trust me. And it might seem like evil is having a heyday in our world or in your world, but God knows their day is coming. He can see everything that they can't see. And here's what he sees is verse 14. The wicked have drawn the sword and strung the bow to bring down the poor and needy, to slaughter those whose way is upright. And here's the end that the Lord sees. Verse 15. Their swords will enter their own hearts, and their bows will be broken. Their swords will enter their own hearts. Their bows will be broken. Maybe this sounds a little bit like some New Testament language you're used to hearing or that you memorized one day, that no weapon fashioned against us will prosper. Right? That whatever weapon the enemy goes to use against the people of God is broken off in their hands or it's turned around on them themselves. And this isn't just the people of earth. This is the powers and principalities of darkness that are opposed to God's people as well. Their bows will be broken. He'll even break their arms, verse 17 says. The arms of the wicked will be broken. That's just a picture of whatever they use, whatever they call their strength. Whatever strength they think they have will be taken away while the Lord protects his own. And nowhere did that happen more gloriously than at the cross of Christ? That what Satan thought was a victory lap for him turned out to be his fate, signed, sealed, and delivered. Right? What he thought would secure eternal death for the people of God instead became our eternal salvation. The strength of Satan, the arm of Satan, used to be sin and death. He could always hold those two things over our heads. Right? He could always hold sin over our heads and point to it and say, look, you have sinned too much. You are not a good person. God doesn't want you. He's holding out on you. There's no way you could get to heaven because you've done too much wrong. Satan, one of his strengths is to hold sin out over us. Even as people who have received Christ and are believing on Jesus for salvation, he still points to that. No, but you're still a sinner. And if he can't get to you with those lies, then he brings around and holds your death over you and just makes you terrified to die. Terrified to face the end of your life. Always living in fear and anxiety. Wanting you to think that, man, dying is the worst possible thing I can imagine. But the cross of Jesus Christ breaks those two strong arms. The power of Satan is broken. Sin no longer has power over us because Jesus wanted to die for sinners. He died for us while we were still sinners, not after we got things figured out and after we got things straightened out. The power of sin was broken for good when Jesus bowed his head on the cross and said, it's finished. It's finished, which means no one in this room can out-sin the cross of Christ. It's impossible. And additionally, death is no longer a threat. It's no longer something to fear or something to hide from. The cross was an instrument of death fashioned against Jesus, against the people of God. But Satan's own plans for evil got turned around and shoved into his own chest as Jesus stood up and walked out of that tomb fully alive. And what Satan thought would signal the end of humanity ended up being the signal for the end of him. I thought somebody would be excited about that, but whatever. You just keep listening. Maybe something will get you. The bow that launches arrows of fear and doubt and accusation against you was snapped in half, and Satan's eternal future was sealed and delivered as Jesus rose as our resurrected Savior. And now, because of his life and death and resurrection, Jesus' blood now surrounds and protects the people of God. He watches over them and shields them. David didn't see this just yet as he was writing, but what Jesus comes along and tells us is, no, he was talking about me, even though he didn't know it. Verse 19, the person who trusts himself or herself to the Lord won't be disgraced in hard times. They will be satisfied in days of hunger. Doesn't mean there's not going to be days of hunger for a believer. Doesn't mean there's not going to be hard times. It doesn't mean that nothing bad will ever happen. But what he is saying is that the everyday problems of life look very different to the one who trusts God. In fact, look at verse 21. Even in times of need, those who trust the Lord and delight in him are generous and gracious. While everyone else, it says the wicked person borrows and does not repay, but the righteous one is gracious in giving. So even while the rest of the world might be, in panic and fear, borrowing stuff from other people and then never paying them back, those who delight in the Lord are not living in fear. They're finding that he is the desire of my soul. He is the delight in my life. He gives me the desires of my heart. My life is an overflow of love for and from the Father, and so I can live in generosity and grace instead of fear. Like, what if the opposite of fear is actually generosity? What if the opposite of anxiety is really giving and an overflow of our lives? But again, because we tend to live in our flesh more than we live in the Spirit, sometimes we start to get a little sweaty with that generosity stuff and think, yeah, but what if God drops the bottom out on me? What if I start to give and he doesn't show up for me? What if he tells me to give away more than I can afford to give? What if at the end of the month I've given enough? This is just the financial part. What if I've given enough that I don't have enough left to pay the bills? Can I outgive God to the point where even God is going, no, don't give. Oh, you did it. Now I don't know what we're going to do. If that's your fear, look at verse 25. This comes from a wise old man who has been following Yahweh since he was a teenager, and here's what he says. I have been young, and now I am old, and yet I have not seen the righteous abandoned or his children begging for bread. He is always generous, always lending, and his children are a blessing. He has never once seen the Lord turn his back on his own children, never once. Instead, he's seen them be increased. They're always generous. They're always letting people borrow their stuff. They're always giving of their time. Their children are a blessing. And his promise is that he will never, ever abandon his people. He will keep his covenant with them. Verse 30 and 31, they'll study his word and they'll gain wisdom and justice and instruction from the Lord. And as a result, they won't be knocked out by current events. They won't be knocked out by evil people. They won't be jealous of people who seem to get away with nonsense. Even when the enemy of your soul turns and fires on you, verse 33 says, God will not leave you in the power of the enemy. I hope you hear this, right? I hope you hear what I'm saying, what David is saying. God will never leave you hanging. Never. And so to sum up Psalm 37 in a few sentences, we don't have time to hit every single verse, but to sum it all up in a few sentences, it would be this. Don't be agitated and anxious when you see evil in the world. Don't get jealous of people who do wrong and obsess over how to beat the system. Because God is not anxious or agitated at all. Remember that evil has a shelf life, but God's promises never do. Evil has a shelf life, but God's promises never do. So be patient and wait expectantly. Sin and death will soon be gone forever. And then lastly, remember that the gospel of Jesus flips evil straight over on its head, turning even the most ugly and horrible act in the world, the crucifixion of the Creator by his creation, into something redeeming and beautiful, giving life and hope and a future to even the worst sinner of them all. Amen.